Subsidies are all the fashion right now. Chalmers and Anthony Albanese are offering a $300 energy subsidy for 1 year, slightly reducing the energy prices that have increased significantly under their watch. Stephen Miles has offered 50-cent transport for 6 months, in Queensland anyway. Politicians appear to have fallen in love with subsidies. Of course, these subsidies seem like they'll only last until just after the respective elections. The energy subsidies expiring after the next federal election is likely to occur. The Queensland transport subsidy expiring just after the Queensland election. So the political calculus seems rather obvious. But still, there are cash handouts and they're hoping that voters will see in their favour. Of course, the hypocrisy is manifest, especially when it comes to Anthony Albanese. He previously criticised politicians acting out of political expediency, yet here he is doing the exact same. This specifically is what Anthony Albanese had said about this.
We've seen what happens when the only test that politicians apply is their political self-interest. We saw it with the former PM, and we're seeing it with the current opposition leader.
Now, the reaction hasn't exactly been kind to either Anthony Albanese, Chalmers, or Stephen Miles. And by unkind, I mean accurate. Because as I've pointed out, these appear to be a bit of a cash handout in service of getting re-elected. And the money for any of these subsidies has to come from somewhere, which after all is just from the taxpayers. If the government is giving a subsidy for energy prices, well, that money doesn't appear out of thin air, it is coming from you and me. And the money isn't coming directly from the politicians' pockets themselves, rather it is coming from taxpayers. The politicians make it out as if they are giving away money, as if the government is helping people out. But in reality, it is taxpayers. In reality, it is you and me. It is not the politicians. The politicians only bear a very small cost of the subsidies, which comes from the impact on their tax payments or the impact that they will feel through increasing government debt. However, they get a massive financial windfall out of getting re-elected. In essence, the politicians gain financially from being re-elected and therefore gain financially from these irresponsible subsidies. The politicians are clearly highly financially incentivized to spend their way into the next re-election. Indeed, Stephen Miles has promised even more largesse as he approaches the Queensland election. He specifically said there is going to be more so-called cost of living relief, which is clearly going to come from taxpayers. It isn't coming from him. It is not the government being benevolent. It is them taking money from taxpayers and then potentially just handing it back to you at best. The problem, of course, with these subsidies is when you think through how they're actually going to impact things like inflation, they don't actually really help the underlying problem, and they ultimately are costing you money. Now, I've talked about this in the context of the federal budget, but in the context of Queensland, it is not any better. A subsidy of this nature is just a one-off reduction in prices. In Queensland, reducing the cost of public transport to 50 cents. At the federal level, reducing energy prices by $300 off their already very elevated prices. In a very naive sense, this is short-term deflation. However, these prices will clearly increase at the end of the subsidy. After the energy subsidy expires, prices will just ratchet up to where they were beforehand. After 50-cent public transport expires, public transport prices will increase back to where they were. This will be inflationary at that time. So that will immediately reverse any deflationary move. Furthermore, the subsidy does nothing to help with the underlying growth rates in the underlying prices. So for example, say there's an energy subsidy, well, energy prices can still grow from that now slightly lower base. The transport prices might be held artificially low by Stephen Miles. However, that then begs further problems, because when you're holding these transport prices artificially low, well, how do you afford to maintain the transport? And that's a bit of an issue, because if you've got these artificially low prices, then revenues from fares will go down. But the costs of maintaining public transport will keep going up. For example, wages go up, electricity goes up, everything is going to increase in price. And as a result, the government is going to end up more and more in the red, which means that taxpayers end up more and more in the red, because taxpayers' rates are going to go towards subsidizing transport, for example. And therefore, a couple of things will have to happen. Either Queensland will just come more and more in debt as a result of spending more and more money in this way, or they might need to increase duties in other areas, or they might need to decrease other spending, and the decrease in other spending might be something important to you. Now, given Stephen Miles' rhetoric, It appears he just wants to spend more and more money, and therefore it would appear that the government is either going to go more into debt, or they're going to increase rates on people, or potentially both. The net result, of course, is a rather myopic policy. They're hoping that voters don't see through this. They're hoping that voters don't see the clear political calculus. They're hoping that people just buy that there's a subsidy coming through the generosity of the government, and that money is appearing out of thin air, and they don't need to worry about how it is being financed. They're hoping people don't scratch beneath the surface. They're hoping people don't ask too many questions. They're hoping that people buy their rhetoric, that these subsidies are actually going to do anything about cost of living over the medium term. They might create a short-term sugar hit, a short-term slight reduction in prices, which, as I've indicated, reverses automatically and mechanically at the end of the subsidy, because the government can't afford to do these subsidies forever, so they are going to need to reverse. And like I've indicated, they will conveniently reverse after the next election, after these politicians are hoping they're going to get re-elected themselves. They're also hoping potentially that maybe the RBA doesn't see through it either. Jim Chalmers has asserted that his subsidies are deflationary. He's asserted that the RBA should therefore not hike rates by as much because of these so-called deflationary subsidies. However, they're clearly not deflationary because they know nothing about the underlying growth rates, and they're going to cause inflation when the subsidies expire. The RBA is not stupid. The RBA can see through this. However, either Jim Chalmers is too ignorant to realize this himself, or potentially he is just misleading voters. Yet more misinformation and disinformation from the government. Similarly with Stephen Miles, misinformation and disinformation about where the money is coming from, seemingly asserting there's this magic pudding the government can draw upon to fund all of these promises, without levelling with people about the consequences of all of this spending. It obviously does not bode well for actual fiscal responsibility. And the underlying problem here, of course, is politicians' incentives. Politicians are incentivized to just get re-elected. They're not incentivized to necessarily do a good job. They're not incentivized to save your money. They're incentivized to get re-elected. And if that costs money, if that costs you money, if that costs the voters money, well then so be it. Because that's what the government is incentivized to do. It is a clear agency conflict, so to speak. It is a clear problem where we, the voters, have hired these politicians to hopefully act in our best interests, but they don't. They're acting in their interests. They're acting for their benefit. They're not acting for our benefit. And then they have the temerity to go and spread misinformation about what they're doing. They have the gall to go and tell us that they're acting for our benefit, when patently they are not. They're acting for their benefit, and they're just benefiting themselves through re-election, rather than benefiting us, the voters. They're spending our money to help themselves. And to make matters worse, they are slathering on a shallow class warfare style rhetoric, where they're trying to pit one category of voters against the other. They're trying to divide and conquer, so by separating voters into different groups, one of which they can excoriate and pillory, they're trying to hope that people just turn on that group, particularly in this case by painting one of them as the big end of town, to use a phrase Anthony Albanese likes to talk about, suggesting that those voters should be taken advantage of. They're clearly buying into the politics of division. The net result is that Stephen Miles, Anthony Albanese, and Jim Chalmers are spending your money in service of their own personal interests in getting re-elected. They then spread misinformation and disinformation about their policies, while gaslighting us about disinformation and misinformation coming from other sources. It is clearly hypocritical. We just have to hope that enough people see through the rhetoric before the next elections.